Got it. Okay. Well, I am so pleased to be here. And first, I want to thank Mike Backfield for arranging the talk, and Art Bloom and Ben Breakstone for setting up the PowerPoint pictures and everything else. What I'm going to talk about are snapshots of the late 50s, 60s, and 70s, and personal experiences that I had with civil rights. For some of you, especially the ones who lived through it, this will be familiar. But to others, it will be maybe a new perspective on the civil rights. I was not a civil rights activist. Back in 1960, I just wanted a single room as a freshman at Women's College. I want to tell a little bit about my childhood. Obviously, growing up in Columbia, South Carolina, it was completely segregated. The buses, the schools, the theaters, restaurants, everything was segregated. And I wonder if there was anything about my being Jewish that made me particularly sensitive to civil rights. And I thought about my father. Actually, my whole family was involved in the conservative Beth Shalom House of Peace. Grandfather was president, then father. They built the synagogue. The sanctuary is named after my grandfather, M.B. Khan. M.B. was the only Jewish contractor in Columbia, and he heard expressions like Jews are only good for money. But Dad and Grandpa founded the Jewish Community Center, and Dad led the UJA. And of course, it was things that I would have heard, like, do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with thy God. But I think it was the role model of my father in civil rights that made me sensitive to prejudice. Dad was appointed to a secret mayor's committee to integrate businesses. It wasn't a particularly moral decision, it was strictly business. But Black and white leaders orchestrated the peaceful desegregation of Columbia's lunch counters in 1962, 2 years before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And then also from the Mayor's Committee, there was a Greater Columbia Community Relations Council to promote and calm racial tensions. Dad was vice president of that. So although he met with African-American leaders, my life was completely segregated. We had a Black maid and a Black cook, but socially, my life revolved around BBYO. My parents had friends in the Jewish community and at the University of South Carolina. I wanted to give just a little context of when I got to WC. And some of this you will remember easily. In 1896, you all know Plessy versus Ferguson established the concept of separate but equal doctrine. And then in 1954, the Supreme Court overturned Plessy with Brown versus the Board of Education. What you may not know is that in 1956, the Supreme Court decision about banning racial segregation in public schools was based on North Carolina. And the ruling was that tax-supported Consolidated University of North Carolina, which was Chapel Hill, NC State, and WC, Women's College, could not deny admission on the basis of race. So in the fall of '56, WC admitted 2 Black women. Can I have picture 2? There they are, Joanne Smart and Betty Tillman. And they roomed together, of course, so they would share their own bathroom. Reading in the oral histories, I heard Joanne Smart was reported to say she was so scared to go to the cafeteria the first night that she and Betty ate the box of chocolates that Joanne's mother had given them. That's what they had for dinner. But then they went on, and it may have been that other students were quiet, but they weren't hostile. Joanne also told about being invited to go downtown and maybe go to a delicatessen, a Jewish delicatessen for lunch. And Joanne said she didn't know anything about delicatessens, Jewish or otherwise. So they went. And I'm not too happy to report that either the manager or the owner came out and said, we can't serve you. So the atmosphere was not completely welcoming. I want to tell you about the acting chancellor at WC. And I got all my information from the Greensboro Record. The chancellor, Pearson, reported that there would be calm acceptance of the Negro students. But in his opening address with the two girls in attendance, he, quote, said, undoubtedly, they, the Negro students, are entitled to just and fair treatment. The two Negro girls are here by decree of the federal court, not by the consent of the governed or the will of the people. And he placed the burden of reaction of the behavior of on the Negro students. He said, much will depend upon the tact, forbearance, modesty, self-restraint, and meritorious conduct of the Negro student if they are to win recognition and earn respect. And what about the white students? He said they, quote, will be expected to avoid the extremes of either hostility or exaggerated humanitarianism. And again, the headline of the Greensboro Daily News in September '56 said, Negro girls were not sought. Some of the faculty in their oral histories were very much in favor of integration. So I don't want you to think it was the whole administration. When WC integrated in the fall of '56, the Black two girls, women, were isolated with their own bathroom. And historian Alan Trelease has said from '56 to '60, when I came, all the upper class Black students were put in former counselors' rooms, sort of semi-segregated because they had their own bathroom. So I enrolled in 1960, and I was assigned a Jewish roommate. We all were. I don't know what the administration was really thinking, but putting the nicest light on it, maybe they thought we were more comfortable with Jews. But there were 6 empty rooms in one of the dorms with all the Black students. And some of the white students were triple. And so I decided that I would move into the Black suite. And I had to get my parents' permission. And then it turned out that my best friend, who was also Jewish, Ellen Berman from Danville, Virginia, moved down to the Black suite with me. The first thing I noticed was how much we had in common. Their grandfathers played whist. My grandfather played pinochle. They're about the same. And of course, the Black girls had the same concerns about grades and boys and clothes that I did. So what about life at WC? There we were, those boys, of course, were not on campus. One of the neat things about a girls' school is there wasn't going to be any interracial dating. But there were rules. You had to sign out on the weekend for approved housing. That is, my brother was at Duke. When I dated over at Duke, I had to sign into a particular approved housing. When you're on campus on the weekends, you had to be home in your dorm at 12 midnight. And during the week, it was 10 o'clock that you had to be in the dorm. I joined different clubs, and one of them was the literary club. And in the Black Suite, we just left the doors open and went back and forth, just very, very comfortably. And I got to be friends with one of the Black students named Diane Oliver. And there she is. She's wearing the class jacket. We all had class jackets. I had asked Diane one day, let's go down to the theater, the movies, very close to campus, right a few blocks. And Diane explained to me that she could not sit with me, that she would have to go in another entrance and sit upstairs. So I'm not too proud of this, but I went ahead and went to the movie. But when I came home, back to the dorm, I wrote, along with Ellen, my other good friend, a statement to boycott the cinema and Franklin Drugstore and the College Inn and Donut Dinette. And we got 117 signatures. But the administration called me in and said, the Greensboro sit-ins had begun February 1, 1960. So much was going on downtown that the administration asked us not to circulate the boycott. So we didn't. That summer, I invited Diane to come home with me to Columbia. She rode the bus, the Greyhound, from Charlotte, where her father had been was principal of a Black high school. And you can imagine the looks we got of a hug, seeing each other, Black and white girls. And we ate dinner, of course, at home. And I took her to meet some of my friends. Dad was fine. I have to say, Mother laid it on a bit thick. She hugged her hello in the morning and she hugged her goodnight at night. Diane's father and family invited me to come back. But Dad, my father, felt, although it was safe for us to have Diane in our house, he didn't want to put the Black family in any jeopardy. So, you know, I never talked about Diane being at our house with the Black cook, but I could tell that Estelle was, at the very least, uncomfortable. And, you know, we never talked about it. In '62, I transferred to GW in Washington, and I graduated in '64. In the fall of '64, I began a master's of English and Education at the University of Pennsylvania. And I did my practice teaching at John Bartram High School in West Philadelphia, an integrated school. But I was already very comfortable. Then in 1966, I married Mike and we moved to Richmond, Virginia, totally segregated city again. I was interviewed for a teaching position, and I was asked to remain overnight to meet with the head of the public schools. What they wanted was a white teacher to go into Maggie Wallcer High School, an all-Black school. This is sort of funny to me. They asked me if I had any friends where I could spend the night with them. And I said, no, but I'll just call the local synagogue and they'll put me up. So I called, and the woman on the phone, now I won't say she called or used the word schnorrer, but she said no, she couldn't do that. Anyway, the public school system put me up. It turned out that I was offered 3 jobs, 2 in the adjacent counties and 1 in the city. And next slide, picture 5. I took the job at Maggie Wallcer High School. Number one, it wasn't far from our apartment, and we shared 1 car, and Mike could either bicycle or take the bus to the Medical College of Virginia, where he was beginning medical school. Maggie Wallcer was named after the first African-American woman to found a bank. She began the St. Luke's Penny Savings Bank to, quote, put our money together and reap benefits ourselves. She was devoted to civil rights and economic empowerment. Her mother was a former slave. This school was built in 1938, so it wasn't that long after the Civil War. Anyway, as a high school English teacher, I really lucked out. I was asked to participate in a first-year teachers National Association of Secondary School Principals project. And I was given an extra free period, which was wonderful. I was with an experienced teacher, and he took me around and showed me the neighborhoods where the students came from, and we talked about curriculum. What luck. These are my students. I felt comfortable with these students. Look at them. And I almost, even with the faculty, I almost felt protected. This was 1966. And to be honest, they were sort of grateful that I was there. I even started a literary magazine for the students, which I thought was sort of like the New Yorker. It wasn't. And Mike brought organs from the lab at medical school for the biology students at Maggie Wallcer. And most of the students were very well-mannered, polite, well-dressed, much like my high school students. It was a whole panoply. When Martin Luther King was killed at around Easter time, 1968, some of my students went downtown just to see what was going on. You remember the riots in most of the cities with Martin Luther King assassinated. The newspaper said my students were marauders out or who knows what. So that was my first indication of how other people saw my students. Mike and I were invited to church and introduced when we went to church with them. As far as what I taught, for example, in Shakespeare, we read Othello and saw the movie version with Laurence Olivier. My students could not believe that the English actor was white and with a wig. If you can show some of the other pictures, there I am, one more. There I am with another student teacher who was also part of that project, Dolores. And then maybe another one. Maggie Walker was definitely not separate but equal. We had an industrial arts class at Maggie Walker and a cosmetology in the basement. But as far as the biology in the labs, next slide. Let's see. Oh, there they are. They weren't really voting because they were too young, but it was a mock election. How you get a good sense of what they look like. But as far as the microscopes, there weren't enough microscopes in the biology lab. And one year, typewriters came from the school system. We signed for them. And then a week later, they were taken away. So separate but equal, no. The library was underused because the books were so old and worn. So I made the students go to the library once a week and check out a book. I didn't care what it was. And some of my techniques showed that I was trying to make it relevant. In 1966 to 70, it was a period of transition for the Black community. Black faces. Let's see one or two other slides of the students. Yeah, there's the chemistry class. And then, okay, hold that for a minute. The students always had service projects, giving at Thanksgiving food to the needy. You might ask, were these students upper middle class? Well, no, they were at best middle class or lower socioeconomic. After all, this was the early 60s, but they always had service projects. Getting back, the Black faces were beginning to be seen in media, but my school and the administration did not want to emulate H. Rat Brown or CORE or SNCC. They did not endorse African hairstyles. Don't forget, I was 24 years old when I started teaching 16, 17, 18-year-olds. So one of the things was what to do about a student who waited for me after school. A vice principal, a woman whom I asked, said, easy, shut your door, lock it, go to the library, leave a sign on your door, I'm in the library. And sure enough, that young man really didn't want extra help. The result of this middle class looking student body, I'd like to tell you a little of Arthur Ashe, who was a Walker graduate. He returned to speak to the class in his tennis shorts and UCLA racket. Ashe had won Wimbledon in 1975 and played in the Davis Cup. But growing up in Richmond, he was banned from the public tennis courts. And now the boulevard is named Arthur Ashe Boulevard. And there he is with his tennis racket and his books. And the boulevard intersects with Monument Avenue. And you know what? The statue of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson and the others. But when Monument Avenue, in 1992, when the statue was erected, it was near Monument Avenue, which when was founded, had a restrictive covenant stating, quote, no lots can ever be sold or rented on Monument Avenue to any person of African descent. My last year of teaching in 1969, I finished the school year and gave birth to our first child in October. And students came to see me with gifts. But the unintended consequence of the 1970s, where my Black students could then begin attending high schools, white high schools like John Marshall and T.J. Thomas Jefferson, it began to dilute the community feeling of the Black community. If one of my students got into trouble, by the time he got home off the bus, his mother knew about it. And of course, the Black principals were not put in charge of white schools. That took a long time. But in 1991, Maggie Wallcer became the Virginia Governor's School of Government and International Studies with competition to gain entrance. So it was a very good school. It went down, and then it became the Governor's School. And it was recently voted the 5th best public high school in the US by Newsweek. Now, the next picture is 2017. The city of Richmond erected a statue of, guess who? Maggie Wallcer, downtown. I want to read you the 2 sentences of the dedication. Quote, "This statue stands as a testament to the Richmond community that values memory as well as meaning, past as well as progress, a democratic process as well as visionary leadership, and equality as well as individuality." So things came full circle. In 1977, we moved to Winston-Salem, and I got a master's in counseling and began working at Wake Forest University in the counseling center. And sometimes I facilitated Black women's support groups because we didn't have a Black counselor. After being on the staff at Wake for 9 years, I left the counseling center and joined the education staff at Grenolda, where I worked until 2005. One of the programs that I co-led was called Examining Your Prejudices by Looking at American Art. And the idea was, if a group of, say, business people who didn't know each other very well were placed in a group and looked at artwork, and each of them saw something different, then perhaps they saw other things differently. In 2005, I was invited to join the Wake Forest University Board of Trustees. And Herb, Sonny Brenner, was the only other Jewish trustee that they'd ever had. And sadly, he died before he finished his first term. And his wife, Brenner, finished his term but did not remain on the board. Now, why was I asked? It might have had something to do with being Jewish, but what Tom Hearn, the president of Wake Forest, said was I was chair of the Rinalda House Board of Directors, and Tom Hearn wanted a close relationship between the university and the museum. And so he put me on the board. And I'll tell you how long I've been on the board in a minute. But there was a Maggie Wallcer reunion. My daughter Jenny and her husband lived in Richmond, a few blocks from my old apartment on Monument Avenue. And I had told Jenny about Maggie Wallcer, and she arranged a private tour. So I'm walking around, and a woman comes out of one of the offices and said, "Did you teach Maggie Walker?" I said, "I think you taught my father." "Who's your father?" "Rudolph Davis." I said, "Rudy, you look just like him." So I stayed in touch with Rudy all these years. And then in 2019, I was invited to the 50th reunion of the class of 1969. There's Rudy on the right and his wife, Dorothy. They gave me a corsage. They let me have a little talk. And what I said was that they taught me much more than I taught them. If you can show some slides from the reunion, they are the men. Now, Dragons was the mascot of Maggie Walker. So they're the men and they're the women. Slow down and let's take a look at them. There were a few that I recognized, and as soon as they said their name, I recognized them. But then you wonder, what did they do? Many of them went to college, either Hampton Institute or Howard or Virginia Union, which is in Richmond. And I had two extraordinary students, and one went to MIT and one went to Mount Holyoke. None of them pictured were those students, but it was the beginning of universities wanting Black students. They're the men. Most of the men were either in business for themselves or middle management. Of course, they were the ones that came back, like always. Reunions show the people that did the best, had the best lives. And a fair number of them were preachers, were ministers. So, and there they are. Now the statues on Monument Avenue have come down and the other statues have been erected. I had mixed feelings. I know it was absolutely necessary to take down Robert E. Lee, but they were beautiful statues. Artistically, I liked them, but they had to come down. Now, after 13 years on the board at Wake Forest, I'm now a life trustee of Wake Forest University, still the only Jewish trustee that I know of. Mike and I established the American Ethnic Studies program at Wake Forest to support speakers and programs of all religions, race, ethnicity, and especially we thought it would be an apt place to study immigration. We also established a chair in Jewish history and studies at Wake Forest. So, what's my Jewish background instrumental in the civil rights actions? I definitely think it played a role. And I really appreciate y'all listening to me and hearing me out. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So isn't there a Maggie Walker State or National Park, part of the Blue Ridge Parkway?
I'm sorry, a little louder.
Isn't there a Maggie Walker State Park or National Park up in Virginia?
Do you know, I've never heard of that.
I heard a Blue Ridge Parkway video show just about a week ago. They put these on monthly, and I was not familiar with that park, but a young woman who was African American is now the head of the head ranger up there, and she gave a wonderful presentation of her life.
That's wonderful. She probably is brought out as other icons are to illustrate a Black businesswoman.
she grew up living very close there, and she and her family used to hike up to the top up there. And so she didn't even know it was any kind of a public or a parkway, but that's
Oh,
how she got
really?
interested. Yes. And then she applied for that job there.
Um, did I go through the talk too fast, or was everybody
Debbie, I
hanging
thought
in
you
with
did it. I thought you did a great job, Debbie. And there are a couple of points I want to bring up. One is, as I was listening, I thought, oh, our high schoolers need to listen to you. Like, what a powerful presentation, kind of for our teens to hear of your role. And just, if nothing else, I think it's so instructive just to look at the pictures, like how life has changed, what going to school means. But what you did, and it, I might not be quite as generous with the school, where you said that, maybe they put you together because they thought the Jewish kids might like to be together. I think that they might have put you together for other reasons. But that, yes, that connection, that you would feel an affinity with the Black students, because as you well lived and know, Blacks in the South in particular, but Blacks and Jews were often put together. And quite coincidentally, I was just driving through Richmond a few days ago, and I was looking for a place to eat. And wouldn't you know it, that I parked right in front of the Maggie Wallcer historic site and her house and Quality Row, these homes. I'm like, oh, so I looked, I read about it, and I thought, this is so interesting. This is a woman, I'm embarrassed. I don't know her story at all. And then you started talking like, I just was there 4 days ago or whatever it was. So I think it's really quite something, though, your story, and an important one. So thank you very much for sharing it. And I'm really glad that we've recorded this, because I think our membership as a whole should hear it, but it's certainly our younger folks to see the role and the importance that one person can make by what does it mean to serve our country. You're going to do that job as a teacher. That's serving our country. And I really appreciate it. I
wanted you to know I wasn't any firebrand. It was
not, you don't need to be a firebrand, but you need to get it in, so to speak, in the trenches to work. And you did in a modest, and not with some, I was going to change. You just did your job, but doing your job in that way, in that capacity, that was really important. And you should just go on in strength. And you carried forward also, even when you guys moved down here to Winston and into the work that you've continued to do.
I also think that the role modeling that my parents, especially my father, did, made me, in a large part, the person I became.
Sure.
Now, Art grew up really close to Richmond.
Yes, I grew up in Petersburg, Virginia, and Rabbi Mark sent me a picture. He stopped there on his way to Richmond yesterday and sent me a picture where he ate at a barbecue restaurant in Petersburg.
Yes, I drive 95 just to stop and find places to eat. Yeah. I go up and down 95. That's all I do.
Yeah, but my upbringing was very similar to yours, Debbie, and it really, because it in Petersburg, it was we had one temple. It was a very small Jewish community, and so it was very much the same experience.
It's funny, my friend Ellen Berman from Danville, Virginia, I've been friends with her, and I called her and told her, actually, this talk way back when I was getting a master's degree at Wake, I wrote a paper about integrating WC and why did it integrate so early and so with so little fanfare. And I can't prove it, but the Jewish community in Greensboro was completely integrated into life. And Laura Wheel a Jewish woman wrote the alma mater song for WC. So, and of course, Durham had a Jewish mayor, but for some reason, I can't place historically why Greensboro seemed to me to be more amenable. But I guess it ends up being who was the leader in a town, who were the civic leaders. And if you do take a leadership role, you never know what the outcome will be. By the way, someone asked me one time, whatever happened to Diane Oliver? And it's sort of tragic. When between her junior and senior year, this part is not tragic, but she won a scholarship by Mademoiselle magazine to be the editor, a guest editor. That was a big deal in the 60s. And she was a guest editor, and she went to New York, and she's Black, and they were going to have a dinner, and they didn't know what to do with her about a date because they put everybody else with a date. So Diana wrote me that they gave her an Indian from New Delhi as her date because he was as close as they could get to somebody Black. But the sad thing is, she graduated with honors and went to the Iowa Writers School. And she was riding on the back of a motorcycle with a friend, and they had an accident and she was killed. And so I never saw her again after 1964.
Debbie, it's
Yeah.
Lynn Eisenberg. Hi.
Hey, Lynn.
Sorry, you can't see me. This was so wonderful, and we've been friends a long time, but you have just introduced me to so much more about your life and how much meaning and how much you have helped people. And I just cherish knowing that and appreciate your being on tonight telling us about this. And you and I have talked plenty about having fathers who were so important in the way that we presently live our lives and admire them so much. So this is just another layer, and I'm just so happy to know all of it.
Oh, I think everyone has stories to tell like this. We just need to tell them. And welcome to my guest room, which used to be Ben's room now. I'm not techie, so I don't know how to put up another background. Thank you, Lynn, so much. And let's have lunch really soon.
Yes, I'd love that. Absolutely.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you,
And
Debbie.
I'll close.